Welcome back, everyone. For today's video, we are going to be taking a look at the second set of the semifinal matches being held in the Champions Chess Tour in Toronto, Canada. Now, on day number one, we had Nodirbek Abdustorov winning against Wesley. So we also had Magnus Carlsen winning against Fabiano. What that meant is that both Wesley and Fabiano, the two remaining American players, would have to win two matches against Magnus and Nodirbek, respectively, to make it to the grand finals. So, of course, the match we're going to be looking at is the match between Magnus and Fabiano. And on day one, Fabiano had a great chance to win the match, wasn't able to get it done in regulation, and then in the Armageddon game, he was unable to win with the white pieces. So, first game we're going to be taking a look at is game number 3 of the second match between Magnus and Fabiano. Now, there's so many games, so many interesting moments, it's very difficult to pick and choose, but I'll give you guys a little bit of a recap. Game number 1 was a draw on the second day. Game number 2 was a game where Fabiano was winning for most of the game. It was +4 at some critical moments. He was unable to win when all was said and done, and drew in the second game despite being +5. So, third game of the day, we have Magnus playing with the white pieces, Fabiano with the black pieces, and let's jump right into the action. So the game starts with the move d4 from Magnus with white. We get knight to f6, and now we have the move c4 being played. After c4, Fabiano plays e6, we get knight to f3, and now we have the move d5 being played. Here, knight c3 is played by Magnus, and now we get c5 from Fabiano. Now, this is what we call the semi-tirage, or the semi-trash, we're being memey per se. It's been played by a lot of players, including myself. It's considered to be extremely solid, and generally it leads straight to an endgame for the most part. So we got pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen takes, pawn takes, and now we have e4 from Magnus, and here Fabiano takes on e4. Now, all this is well-known theory. We got the queen trade, knight to e5 played here, attacking the pawn on f7. Now, this is the first move that perhaps is not the absolute main line. Normally, white plays this move, knight to g5, attacking both the pawns on f7 as well as e4. And after bishop to e6, takes, bishop g5 here. Black can play bishop e7 or king e8 here in this position, and the show goes on. Generally, it's considered to be equal with perfect play, and so that's why Magnus chooses to avoid this variation. So, instead, Magnus plays knight to e5 to attack the pawn on f7, and now we get the move bishop e6, guarding the pawn. Here, Magnus plays bishop to g5, pinning the knight on f6, and potentially trying to take the pawn on e4. After bishop to g5, we get bishop to d6 being played here to attack the knight on e5, and now Magnus castles the king, pinning the bishop on d6, so that you cannot capture the knight on e5. We get king to e7, and now Magnus plays knight c4, retreating the knight because currently the knight has no other squares available. You could maybe go f4 to protect it, but otherwise you will lose this horse. So we get knight to c4. Fabiano plays bishop b4, we get knight to d5 check being played, bishop takes knight, only move, can't recapture the knight due to the pin, of course, and if you move the king, you lose the bishop, and you lose the game with it. So we get bishop takes knight, rook takes bishop, we get knight to c6, and now a3 played here by Magnus. Now here, Fabiano has to play the move bishop to e1, and already here you can tell based on the time usage that Fabiano was a little bit unsure of what was going on, and it's also a very tricky position, because black's bishop here on e1 looks really awkward. You'd love to retreat it to any of these three squares, but if you go to a5, spaghetti-o, you're losing the game. d6, same thing. c5, same thing. So e1 is the only square available. Now, this is the only square available for the bishop, but the bishop is very, very close to being trapped. You don't have a5 or b4 available. If white could go king d1 here and bishop takes f2 was not an option, white would simply win the bishop. So, we get the move rook to f5 played by Magnus, intending to go king d1, winning the bishop on e1. We have knight to d4 attacking the rook to e5, knight to e6, and now bishop h4 is played here by Magnus. Now, after bishop to h4 in this position, once again, white is threatening king to d1 to win this bishop on e1, but Fabiano finds the only move in the position to not lose, which is this move g5. Now, the reason for this, if you were to play a move like rook d8, for example, stopping the king to d1 idea here, white can simply go bishop to e2, and now your bishop on e1 is under attack. d2 is covered by the knight. Pawns cover the other critical squares. You have no retreats, and you will lose the bishop. And once again, you will lose the game. So, Fabiano finds g5 here, but on the other hand, Fabiano has used so much time here. He's got 4 minutes and 23 seconds. Magnus is 8.5 minutes, so it's very, very difficult. So we get bishop takes g5, Fabiano plays bishop takes f2, and now Fabiano has freed his bishop. The bishop is free to go back to b6, c5, or d4 down the road, and now it should be okay. On the other hand, Fabiano low on time. He's also playing against the greatest endgame player of all time, Magnus Carlsen, and there are still some difficulties. So we get rook takes e4. Rook c8 played here by Fabiano. Of course, he can't capture the bishop or the rook here. Both of D's knights are pinned. The knight on e6 pinned by the rook. The knight on f6 pinned by the bishop. So we get rook c8. King b1 played here by Magnus to sidestep any threats like, say, bishop e2 and b5, for example, which would win the horse on c4. So we get king to b1, rook c5 played by Fabiano, trying to break the pin once and for all. We get bishop takes knight, king takes, and now bishop e2 is played here by Magnus. Now you can tell from the computer evaluation white is only slightly better, but it is Magnus Carlsen at the end of the day, and the Magnus effect is very, very real, especially in this match where Fabiano has had so many chances to win and he's been unable to convert. So we get bishop d4, rook f1 check, king to e7, knight to e3 played, and now Fabiano trades the bishop for the knight. Now again, it looks like this should be an easy draw because both sides have the same amount of material. Both sides have 2 rooks and 4 pawns, knight versus bishop, but black has one big issue. Or 2 issues, I should say. The big issue is these pawns on f7 and h7. The pipos are a little bit split here. And secondarily, the knight is very passive, where this bishop has a lot of scope on multiple diagonals down the road. And this knight can't really move and attack any of the white pawns. So for that reason, white maintains a small advantage. So we get h5. Magnus plays rook to f4 here. Now, h5 is a move I don't like. And the reason I don't like this move is because fundamentally in endgames, when there are bishops on the board, the general rule of thumb, and this is not always true, is that you try to put your pawns on the opposite color of the bishop. So when you put the pawn on h5, it's on a light square, same as this bishop. So the bishop is always spying the pawn here. And if you can't put the pawn on a dark square, this can become a serious weakness down the road. Whereas say you could magically put all the pawns on, I'm just going to set this up. Some position like this, for example, just to illustrate this. I guess white's still better here, but let's get to this position so that you guys can see what's going on. All of black's pieces, except for the king, are on the opposite color of this light square bishop. The knights, the rooks, and the pawns cannot be touched by this bishop on e2. So everything's on the opposite color, so black is fine here. But when you go h5, you're putting this pawn on the same color as the bishop, which is not really what you want to do, and it can become a liability down the road. So we get rook to f4, we get b6 being played, rook to a4 played by Magnus to attack the pawn on a7, a5, and now rook h4. Now, Fabiano has had to push these pawns up the board, which isn't really that big of an issue because they are on the opposite color of the bishop. Now the h5 pawn is seriously weak. So we get rook to g8, g3, rook to g5 played. The rooks laterally guard the pawn on h5 here, and now we have rook h to e4 played by Magnus. We get rook f5 here, intending to go rook f2 and create the kebab on the 7th rank. We get bishop c4, rook to c6, and now Magnus plays rook e2. Here Fabiano goes king f6, we get rook h4 back, rook d6, king a2, b5 played here, and now bishop b3. Now, looks like Fabiano has equalized here, and objectively computer says it's fine, but you still have to be very, very careful in terms of how you play it. So here Fabiano plays move a4, which I think is a serious mistake here. Computer wants this move knight to d4, which is a tough move to play because after rook d2, it looks like the knight is getting pinned here, but after king to e5, black is actually completely fine. So Fabiano plays a4, and now this is starting to fall into the theme of everything that's going wrong, which is Fabiano now has actually put all of these pawns on the same color as this light square bishop. b5 already here, I think, even if the computer says it's fine, is a mistake in my opinion, because once you go b5, bishop b3, you're going to have to make a decision which pawn you're pushing here, whether it's a4 or b4, but the pawns will not be able to remain stable on these two squares. And now after a4, bishop c2, even though the computer says it's still okay for black, all of these dark square pawns, these dark square pawns on the light squares become serious targets for the light square bishop. So Fabiano plays rook c5, we get king b1, rook d5 played here, we get rook f2, king e7, rook f5, now we get takes, and the move rook to d5 is played. Now still okay for Fabiano here, but it's getting more and more difficult by the turn, because now this bishop has many squares to target all of these pawns from. And on top of that, Fabiano is very low on time to boot. So we get rook c5, bishop f3 played here, targeting the pawn on h5, we get knight g7, and now this move rook b4 is played, and Magnus has a very simple idea of going bishop to e2, and now both of these pawns are serious weaknesses. So we get knight to e8, we get bishop e2, knight to d6 played here, rook to h4, and now Fabiano plays rook e5. Now it's still okay, even though you potentially lose the pawn on h5. After bishop takes h5 in a move like knight c4 or rook f5, rook f2, followed by knight c4, black is still kind of on the edge of being okay. So here Magnus plays bishop d3, and this is a move that I cannot understate how good it really is, because what Magnus does here is he understands the time situation, understands the flow, and realizes that he has a lot of time to wait. He does not have to rush things. And with Fabiano having 20 seconds, you kind of want to get him as low as possible on the clock before you make the committal moves and you go all in. So we get rook to c5, bishop e2, rook e5 back, and now Magnus decides to take because he really has to make a decision. Now Fabiano here, instead of having 21 seconds, now he's down to 17, so with 4 seconds less, it makes a difference. So we get takes, knight c4 is played, and now we have king c2, rook to e3 played here. Now this is the first serious mistake from Fabiano. Probably he should have played rook to c5 here, putting pressure on both of these pawns. I assume he was very worried about king to c3 with the idea that after knight a3, king b4, rook c4, white can simply take the knight since the pawn guards the rook. So we get rook to e3 here, going for rook b3, trying to win the pawn on b2. Magnus plays bishop d1, we get rook e1, bishop to f3, rook to e3 played, and this is a blunder. After the move rook to f1, Fabiano still had some chance to maybe save the game after bishop e2 and rook f2 to pin the bishop. Rook e4, king d6, and king c3 is better for white, and I do think, considering the time situation, Magnus would probably win, but nonetheless, the game goes on after knight b6. But when Fabiano plays the move rook to e3, he blunders this move rook to e4, checking the king, forcing rooks off the board, and now there's nothing Fabiano can do here because these pawns on b5 and a4 are on the same color as the bishop. White has an outside h pawn that he can just start pushing up the board here, and it's all but hopeless. So we get king d6, bishop d3, knight e3, king d2, knight g4. Magnus plays h3, knight f2, takes, and bishop a4. And now white simply has 2 extra pawns on the queen side, and the rest is very straightforward. We get knight g5, king e3, king e5, bishop c2 to cut off the knight e4 jump, knight e6, g4, f6, a4, knight d4, bishop e4, knight b3, bishop d3, knight c5, a5, and now white is simply going to push the a and b pawns up the board and win the game. We get knight e6, a6, and here Fabiano Caruana has to resign the game in view of the fact that white is just pushing p on the queen side. If you go knight c7, a7, white will follow it up with bishop to e4, followed by a8 queen. Black will have to give up the knight, and he will lose the game. So a masterful endgame performance from Magnus. He keeps the game going, small advantage, but he waits until the times get really low, and then he goes all in. Fabiano makes a sad mistake, I guess you could say. He ends up losing this game, and now Magnus leads the match by a score of 2-1 heading into game number 4. Now in game number 4, Fabiano does have the white pieces, but he must win this game to keep the match going. If he does not win this game, he will be eliminated. So we get e4. Magnus decides to play e5. On the first day, he was playing the Sicilian a little bit more. He decides to play e5 on the second day, trying to be more solid. We get knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight to f6, and now we have d3, bishop c5, and bishop g5. Now, so far, all pretty standard. We have the classic Gucci piano here with the bishops on c4 and c5, but bishop g5 is a very interesting idea here. White wants to put the bishop on g3, pressure the pawn on e5, and just keep the game going. Most of the time, white will play something like c3, but after c3, d6, if you don't play bishop g5 very early, say you castle, black can always play h6 to stop any of these bishop g5 ideas altogether. So we get the move bishop g5. Magnus plays h6 here. We have bishop to h4, bishop e7, bishop g3, d6 played. Now, of course, what Magnus is aiming for with the bishop e7 retreat is he has this nice structure of pawns. Bishop is inside the pawn chain here, and black at some point will probably want to play either for d5 or maybe f5 later on. So we get a4, castles, a5. Magnus plays bishop to e6. Now this was repeated from the first game of the match, by the way, this whole idea with bishop e6. In that first game where Fabiano had the white pieces, or second game of the match, I should say, Fabiano had great winning chance, so I was a little bit surprised to see Magnus repeat this variation. I will say that I don't think Magnus is going to continue to play this variation against bishop g5, h4, g3 with bishop e6, because both these games he got bad positions. So we get the trade of the bishops. Now c3 played here by Fabiano. We get b5, and now the move queen b3 is played. Now, I believe in game number 2 of the match, Fabiano traded the pawns on b6 and played something like knight d2. Maybe he had already castled first, but at any rate, he went for the classic glitch move with n peasant. But in this game, he chooses not to play n peasant, and he keeps the a file closed. So we get queen to b3. Queen d7 played here by Magnus. Castles played by Fabiano. We get a6, knight bd2, knight h5, and now rook fd1. Now, it's a very interesting position here because black has these double e pawns on e5 and e6, but in return, he has an open f file. That being said, white has multiple ideas here. White can play d4 to play in the center of the board and put pressure on e5. White can also play ideas like rook c1 and c4 to try and open up the c file as well. So there's a lot of dynamic play here for both sides. So here Magnus goes g5, trying to attack on the king side. And I think the reason for g5 here is that Magnus understood that the king side is where he has to go for something quickly, because if white gets c4, d4, positionally black is actually in a lot of trouble. So we get g5. Fabiano plays h3 to stop the move g4. We get knight to f4. Fabiano trades, and now we get this move d4. Now, it looks very scary with so little protection of the king on g1 here, but with the pawn on h3 stopping g4, ideas like d5 or d takes e5 both in play, and even c4 here, white actually is doing quite well. So we get rook f8. Fabiano plays d5, another excellent move here to pressure the knight and the pawn. If black were to take on d5 here after e takes d5 and knight d8, white is actually close to winning here after knight takes e5, sacking the knight. Pawn takes knight d6 here, and after, say, knight f7, takes in this position, white can simply go g3, rook f5, knight to e4. And with this great outpost on e4, ideas like queen d5, control of the d file here, one sample line like king g7 being played after queen d5 with ideas like queen d7, queen b7, white is actually much better. Computer thinks that white's almost close to winning, in fact, so it's very hard to play. So Magnus does not trade, he goes knight d8 instead. Now we get the move knight to f1 from Fabiano, and this move is a mistake, but it's very hard to fault Fabiano or Magnus in this position for what occurs, because from a human perspective here, you're very worried about h5 and g4 attacking on the king side here, and it feels like you need to get more pieces over. Maybe the knight to g3, maybe to e3, maybe rook d2 to guard the pawn at f2, but you're always worried about the sacrifice. But if you can get this knight to g3 here, you always have just enough protection. Say you get something like rook d2, queen f7, king g2, white is better because this knight on g3 anchors all the defense on the king side. So knight f1 does make a lot of sense. Also, if black ever trades, say you got some position like this, for example, now the knight can go via e3 or g3 to this f5 square where it's supported by the pawn on e4. So Magnus plays h5, which is still okay. Computer says after king h8, black is better, but again, it's a rapid game. Let's be serious, we're not 3,500. So we get h5, knight e3 played by Fabiano, and now we get the move g4, takes is played, knight to h2, and here Magnus Carlsen makes a huge blunder with the move rook f4, taking the pawn on f2. Now, the reason this is a mistake is because in this position, after rook f2 and knight takes g4, as we'll see, white's king is actually very, very safe here. That being said, it's very hard to fault Magnus again because the pawn on g4 is under attack. If you don't do any, how can you guard this pawn on g4? If you take on d5, for example, after queen takes d5, let's just say king h8, white can play queen takes e5, winning the game. If you play like knight f7 to guard the pawn on e5 against the capture, now white can go g3, removing the rook from f4, and now after knight f5 and knight g4, it's spaghetti-o time. White is simply much better, if not winning. So if you don't take the pawn, how do you guard g4? On top of that, if you play rook takes e4, which is another move that looks logical, there's this move queen c2 attacking the rook here. After rook f4, queen g6, king h8, and I think probably check, and I'm guessing h. Yeah, knight h8, g4. White is actually once again close to winning here with the knight jumping, queen coming over, g3 to hit the rook, and black does not have any defenses for the king on g8. So Magnus blunders with rook f2. Again, hard to fault him because it's without having half an hour on the clock, very difficult to find the apparent only equalizing move with bishop g5, where after takes, now if white goes queen c2, rook f4, queen g6, there's queen g7 covering on the king side. So very hard to spot without half an hour. I don't think any human could ever find this move. So we get rook f2. We have knight takes g4, rook f4, and now Fabiano plays c4, the most explosive move on the board, pun intended, of course, with the idea of lifting the queen over to the king side to go after the black king. So we get pawn takes pawn, queen g3 from Fabiano, king to h7. Now we have queen to h3 check, king g8, rook a3, another awesome move, lifting the rook to the king side. We get bishop g5, rook to g3. Now these ideas like knight h6 are a very serious threat, and the game is simply over. We have queen g7, Fabiano plays knight to f3, even further harassing this bishop. All of white's pieces here on the king side are aiming towards the black king, and Magnus decides to sack the rook with rook takes knight, but after pawn takes, king f7, we get to move knight to f2, trying to put pressure on this pinned bishop on g5. Now we have the move king e7, rook to c1 played, Magnus goes rook h8, we get queen g4, overloading the pressure towards the bishop on g5, knight f7, rook takes c4, attacking the pawn on c7, king to d8, and now after d takes e6, Magnus Carlsen has to resign the game because the knight on f2 stops a checkmate. So if you go queen h6, I just take, no mate on h1 here, and queen h2, king f1, white is simply winning the game. And you can't actually move the knight because it's simply trapped here. There are no squares available for the knight to go to. Actually, you could play knight e6, I should say, but after takes, white simply has an extra rook, and once again, it's GG. So Magnus resigns this game, which means that Fabiano finally gets a critical win, but unfortunately, it's only enough to force a second Armageddon. So let's jump right into the action. So in the Armageddon, I believe Fabiano bid something like 9 minutes and 10 seconds, if I'm not mistaken. Fabiano bids 9:10. I believe Magnus bid about like 10 minutes. And so Magnus Carlsen gets the white pieces in this Armageddon game, unlike the previous date, but Magnus must win. So we get e4 from Magnus. Fabiano plays e5. We get knight to f3, knight to c6, and now we have the move bishop b5. Actually, I think Fabiano bid 9:59 based on the time, so maybe I'm thinking of the other Armageddon game between Noterbeck and Wesley. But at any rate, this is what we get. So we get bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight to f6, castles, and Fabiano decides to play his patented open Spanish with knight takes e4. Now, this is an interesting choice because on the first day, Fabiano was playing bishop c5 and b5, trying to promote his classic Dark Archangel Chessable course online. But today in the Armageddon, instead, he decides to go for the open. Now, this is a line Fabiano has played many times. He played against me in the Candidates in Madrid in 2022. He did lose that game with the black pieces, but it's one of the systems that in an Armageddon game, it makes a lot of sense because it forces the issue very early. The position becomes very clear around move 10 or 15. There are not a lot of ways to keep all the pieces on the board without some trades occurring. So we get d4, bishop to e7 played here. Now, this is already a little bit surprising, honestly, because Fabiano could have played d4, b5, bishop b3, and this transposes back into the standard open Spanish after d5 takes and bishop to e6. Instead, we get bishop to e7. Now, one of the funny things about this is that in another lifetime in 2019, this was actually played in a couple of games. I think it was 2019, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it was played in the game between Fabiano with the white pieces against Magnus Carlsen in I believe in Zagreb, Croatia, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong with that. But also, I'm almost certain that Fabiano actually played this against me in the Sinquefield Cup some months later. So, a different world, different lifetime ago when this whole line with Rook E1 was played. We got b5, bishop to b3 was played here. I believe in both the games that involved Fabiano, myself, and Magnus, it involved, I think, Rook E4, I think it was d5, takes, and b takes a4 was played in both of those games. But in this game, we get something different with bishop to b3, we get d5, and actually we've transposed now back into the regular open Spanish after de5 and bishop to e6, except white has played this rook e1 move instead of the more standard moves like c3 or knight d2. Just to illustrate what I mean by that, normally when you get to this position, white plays knight d2 here or c3 in this position. But rook e1 is playable, but it's considered a bit of a sideline. So we transpose back into the open Spanish, the regular one with rook e1 being played. Fabiano here plays bishop e6. We get c3, castles, h3 played to stop bishop to g4. Fabiano plays queen d7, and now we get to move bishop c2, putting pressure on the knight on e4. Now, when I said that the situation clarifies very early on in the game, what I meant by that is if you're playing this position in Armageddon with black, you want to have straightforward ideas. You want to be able to tunnel on specific plans. And here, black has very few ideas. So black can play bishop c5 to pressure the pawn at f2. Black can try to play rook d8 and d4, or black can try to play this move f6. But those are really the only ideas you have. So it's very easy. You get to tunnel on the plans, which means you don't have to spend a lot of time. So Fabiano plays rook d8. Now, computer actually does like f5 or f6 a little bit more, but he goes rook d8. We get knight b d2, and now we got the trade and bishop to f5 being played. Now, bishop f5, very important move here, because if you were to just play a quiet move like rook e8, now white can play queen f4, bringing the queen over to the king side. You also have ideas like knight g5, and with these bishops on c2 and c1, white is in very good shape. So we get bishop to f5 from Fabiano. Magnus trades and plays queen f4. Now, Magnus was playing these moves relatively quickly, which tells me that at some point in the distant past, Magnus had looked at this endgame after queen f4, because in an Armageddon game, if you are not prepared, offering the trade of the queens here is completely insane, because Fabiano has 8 minutes on the clock, so he's got a lot of time, and if you don't know this endgame poses difficulty for black, you can never play it. So I don't think Magnus had looked at this before the game specifically, but at some point in the recent past, he clearly looked at this endgame, which is why he was still moving very quickly. So we get queen takes queen, bishop takes queen, and now Fabiano plays d4. Now, one thing that I've mentioned a lot about the Armageddons, both in my live streams on Kick, as well as in some of these recaps, is in Armageddon, there are a couple of critical moments in the game when you need to think and when you need to move quickly. And it's almost impossible to really like study or train for these moments. I'm just going to be honest, I think it's borderline impossible. There's just some sort of intuitive feel or sense, that spidey sense that you have that makes a world of difference in these moments. And Magnus actually in general is the only player I've seen where somehow I feel like probably like 90% of the time when he needs to think, he's able to slow it down at that critical moment. So Fabiano plays very quickly, he trades, and now he goes d4 right away, and this is a mistake. Now, this is probably a situation where Fabiano needed to think, and he probably could have played something like queen g6 or queen e6 to keep queens on the board, but he decides, you know what, I'm going to trade, go d4, try to simplify the position right away, and if I can trade off the pawns in the center of the board, I should never lose the game. Unfortunately for Fabiano, this is wrong. This is exactly what I think Magnus was hoping for with this d4 move, because now after rook a c1, suddenly black has a lot of problems with this knight on c6 in front of the pawn on c7. For example, if black just plays a move like, let's start with d3 because this is one option. After d3, rook d1, rook to d5, for example, white can go e6, opening up the threats towards the pawn on c7. And after, let's just say takes, and rook c8 to guard the pawn on c7 here. Actually, wait, you can't do that. Thanks. What's the way? Let's say rook c8 here. After takes, and rook to e3, white is going to win either the pawn on d3 or the pawn on c7 here, and white should win the game. So you can't really go d3. At the same time, you don't really want to take, after takes, there's pressure on the knight and the pawn. So what do you do? If you play rook d7 here, for example, I can simply go takes, and now after rook takes c7, I hit the bishop b4, I have bishop to e3, white has an extra pawn here. If you go bishop d8, same thing with bishop e3, and it's very hard for black to play. So Fabiano continues to play pretty quickly. He takes a pawn on c3, we got takes, and now he goes knight b4 after a long thing. Now the problem with this whole situation is knight b4 is where Fabiano used about 45 seconds to play the move, but he needed to think before playing d4. Now, I'm not going to fault Fabiano on a personal level, just because, like, for me, I did the same thing. There were many moments in the Armageddons in this event where I made huge blunders. It's just that there's some kind of intuitive sense about when you need to think, and Fabiano uses his time on the wrong move when he thinks for 40 seconds before going knight b4. And the problem is here, Magnus continues to move quickly, plays rook takes c7, we get rook fe8 here. You probably think, why not knight d5, forking the rook and the bishop? Should be good, right? There's no rook c4 here to guard, so what, black wins a piece. But unfortunately, after rook to b7 here, now if you take the bishop, you lose the bishop on e7, and white has an extra pawn. And if you go bishop b4, hitting the rook on e1, white has rook e4 to guard the bishop and target the bishop on b4 at the same time, and white still has this extra pawn in the center of the board. So we get the move rook fe8 played by Fabiano. Magnus goes bishop g5, which apparently is a mistake. By the way, this is where Magnus should have used some of the time. He was up 5 minutes on the clock, but he plays this move bishop g5 very quickly. We get takes, and now f6 is played instantly by Fabiano, and this is a serious error. Once again, this is a moment where Fabiano needed to use his time. This is where Fabiano needed to use like 30-40 seconds and calculate this move knight d3, because after e6, f6, on first glance, it looks like after e7, white is much better here for the following reasons. If black plays rook to d5, white can sack the rook with rook to c8. There's no king f7, knight covers a square, and after takes, queen takes, this is simply checkmate. King can't move up to f7. So Fabiano probably thought, when Magnus he probably saw this for like a split second, just reject it, because he figured after e7, rook d5 is no good. But black can play rook to b8 here, and after this move rook to e3, for example, black can go knight to f4, threatening to fork the rooks with knight to f4. And now after knight to e6, knight d5, rook e2, takes, king f7, takes. Black will win the extra white pawn on e7 and will draw the game. So after e6, f6, computer actually says that white can still play, I think, e7, rook b8. Maybe rook d1 is also playable, but after knight b2, rook b1, it's the same thing here. After takes, king f7, rook e2, and rook b6. Black has rook to e6. He'll win the pawn on e7 and draw the game. So this is the moment where Fabiano needed to use all that time and come up with the right move, but instead he plays f6 after 1 second. And for the second critical moment in the game where I needed to think, he did not think. So we get knight to f7, rook to d2, and now after e6, as you can tell from the valuation bar, white is close to winning here. He's got this nice protected pass pawn. This knight on f7 looks very weird, but it's actually perfectly placed to jump to d6 whenever black tries to take these pawns on the queen side and obtain counterplay. So we get h5 here from Fabiano. Now Magnus plays another awesome move, rook to e4, attacking the knight. If you play knight to d5, white can simply go rook d7, pinning the knight on d5, and there's also knight d6 followed by e7, e8 down the road to win the game. So Fabiano takes the pawn on a2, and now Magnus plays this nice move rook to c6 with a very simple and elegant idea of playing knight d6 once again to attack the rook on e8. The knight on a2, by the way, completely dominated. It has no squares available here. Pawn covers c3, the rooks cover the other two jumps, and for that reason, this knight is simply dead. So white is effectively playing with an extra knight here. So Fabiano goes rook to d5, we get rook takes a6, knight to c1, and now Magnus plays the move rook d6, offering the trade of the rooks. We get rook to c5, rook to d7, and now knight b3 played here by Fabiano. Now here Magnus plays knight d6, and Magnus at this point I think assumed he was just winning on the spot. He was moving super quickly, but he did overlook something here, which is that after rook c1, king to h2, and knight d2, black suddenly attacks the rook on e4, but there's a serious threat of making a repetition via perpetual with knight to f1 on the next turn. Now you might be asking me, how do I know this was a mistake? And the reason I know is because on the live feed, as I was watching the cameras, Magnus shook his head a little bit, his eyes became a little bit larger, but as we like to say in the game of chess, there is no luck whatsoever. So even though Magnus might have missed his knight d2 move, because all of his preceding moves were so strong and good up to this point, it doesn't actually make a difference. Now what I mean is that if white were to take what looks like a free rook on e8, black can force a draw by going check, check, check for infinity moves, and white can't do anything to avoid this repetition with the knight jumping back and forth to f1 and g3. But Magnus uses his time, he plays g4 here, and now even if the rook hangs on e4, black's rook on e8 is hanging at the same time, so white is still completely winning. So Fabiano takes, we get knight takes rook, we get rook to e1, e7 played here, just pushing the pawn. Now the knight can go to c7, d6, or g7 down the road, and it's totally hopeless. So Fabiano plays f5, we get g5, knight takes pawn, knight takes g7, and here Magnus Carlsen wins the game. Fabiano resigns in view of the fact that knight guards the pawn push to e8. If you take the knight, I make the queen, and suddenly it's a check from the rook on d7 towards your king on g7. So you can't really do anything. You could play knight to f3, but after king g3, again, this idea of e8 is simply power overwhelming. So after knight g7, Magnus Carlsen wins a second Armageddon game against Fabiano Caruana. That means that he wins both of the sets in the critical Armageddon game. He moves on to the grand final, where he will be playing against none other than the American player Wesley. So now Wesley had a very tumultuous semifinals. He lost the first day match against Norbek Abdustorov. Second day, he came out very strong, won the first couple of games, wins the second match. The third match was a tie. They went to Armageddon, where Wesley had the white pieces, and Wesley, much like Magnus Carlsen, would win the Armageddon game to secure his place in the grand final, and have a chance to repeat for a second year in a row as the victor of the Chess Champions Tour. So on that note, I hope you guys have enjoyed this recap. I will, of course, be doing a recap on the grand finals between Wesley So and Magnus Carlsen, where the grand prize of $200,000 is up for grabs. So hope you guys have enjoyed the recap. Make sure to smash that subscribe button if you have not already, and I will be back with another recap later today, hopefully. So I'll see you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.